What if a society can fail long before it falls? What if the center gives way quietly, while the buildings still stand, the markets still rise, and the institutions still speak with their familiar voices? Collapse does not always announce itself with fire and rubble. Sometimes it begins in silence, in the unseen places where meaning erodes and trust thins, where power moves faster than awareness and consequences outpace comprehension. A nation can appear unbroken while already carrying the weight of its undoing, spinning forward on momentum alone, blind to the forces gathering beneath its feet. The 8 months that follow are not the story of an ending. They are the story of a turning, a slow, relentless descent into a different kind of rupture. At first, the signs are subtle. Beginnings encoded with domination instead of humility, silences where care should have spoken, fragments of truth offered as though they were whole. But karma is not delayed, it is patient. Each act carries its echo. Choices unintegrated become habits, habits crystallize into structures, structures left unexamined drift out of harmony with the living body they are meant to serve. This is how imbalance compounds, not all at once, but layer upon layer until consequence outpaces control. And still the machinery hums along, even as its foundations hollow. But karma is not fooled by appearances. The ledger always comes due, and when the weight of what is unacknowledged grows too great, the wheel does not slow. It breaks, scattering the fragments into directions no one can guide. When power turns over in a society, there's always the chance for a breath to be taken, a pause in which the community might rediscover its center. The moment of inauguration is meant to embody that pause, not only the transfer of authority, but the recognition that authority itself rests within a fabric greater than any one figure. Balance is upheld when continuity is honored, yet in January, that opening stillness was immediately shattered. What should have been readiness became domination, and what should have been renewal became rupture. The flood of executive orders in those first days was more than bureaucratic housekeeping. It was the will to control, clothed in the language of efficiency, undoing protections for the earth, for workers, for the vulnerable, as if care itself were waste. The creation of the Department of Government Efficiency carried a similar paradox. To name efficiency is to imply harmony, but in practice it was dismemberment, treating the living body of government as an inert object to be cut apart. Even mercy was inverted. The pardons of those who had attacked the capital offered not reconciliation but tribal indulgence, binding the country again to a trauma it had barely begun to face. And when tariffs were cast upon China in one sweeping decree, it was not negotiation, but imposition, a hand forcing the wheel of commerce against its natural flow. The deeper danger is that all of this was not experienced as a sudden shock, but as structure. The violation was not episodic. It was planted as the very foundation of the new cycle. In Buddhist thought, this is the era of mistaking grasping for readiness, of confusing the will to dominate with the openness to begin anew. A society that enters its next turn under such conditions carries forward seeds of imbalance, and these will not remain dormant. They germinate in silence, manifesting later as conflict, as instability, as fracture. What January teaches is not only about the acts themselves, but about the disposition that animated them. To believe that harmony can be manufactured by force, that balance can be imposed rather than cultivated, is to blind oneself to the truth that equilibrium depends on restraint, on humility, on the willingness to preserve continuity even while change is made. The lesson here is stark. If a beginning is encoded with disruption, the arc that follows will not stabilize but spin further from its center. The greater good requires leaders to hold their power as stewards of continuity, not as conquerors of it. In neglecting that, the nation did not simply stumble into imbalance, it began the year already walking the path of disintegration. By February, the energy released in January had already begun to take form. When a wound is struck upon the collective body, there is always a choice: to acknowledge the pain, to meet it with awareness, or to retreat from it, letting it settle unspoken beneath the surface. This month revealed the second path. What unfolded was not the sharp drama of conflict, but the quieter tragedy of dissociation, a refusal to feel what had been set in motion. The Department of Government Efficiency, born only weeks earlier, made its first deep cuts. 30,000 federal workers dismissed. 75,000 more offered buyouts. It was called modernization, presented as vitality, but it was not vitality at all. It was amputation. Entire networks of service, the EPA, the NOAA, the SSA, were pared back under the banner of progress, as though the organs of the state could be removed without bleeding. This was the body dismembered while being told it was becoming leaner, stronger. And yet, the country did not rise in protest. The harm was real, but the response was muted, as though the collective nervous system had gone numb. Even when Canada and Mexico retaliated with new tariffs on U.S. agriculture and energy, signaling a fracturing beyond our borders, there was no great stirring of civic energy. There were no mass gatherings, no sustained debates, only scattered voices of concern. Beneath the churn of policy and trade, a deeper current was taking hold. Avoidance, a withdrawal from the immediacy of consequence. This is how karma embeds itself, not always in the grand clash of forces, but in the quiet surrender of awareness. February's silence was not peace. It was the locking away of pain, a cauterizing of the wound without cleansing it. To turn from what is felt, to retreat from the suffering of others and of the whole, is to leave the seed of harm undisturbed, where it cannot dissolve. And so the injury deepens. There is an old teaching that when the body feels pain, it is the Dharma calling attention to imbalance. If ignored, the sensation does not vanish. It multiplies, traveling along subtler channels until it manifests elsewhere, stronger, more entrenched. February was this, the system remembering its precarity but refusing to speak it. Without the breath of awareness, without compassion meeting disruption, the energy seeded in January began to root itself more deeply, unseen, setting in motion the patterns that will harden in the months ahead. What is more dangerous to a people? The pain they feel, or the illusion that the pain is gone? When the surface is polished to shine while the ground beneath cracks, the soul of a nation forgets how to listen to its own tremors. March was such a moment, an elaborate stillness painted over restless waters. The creation of a national crypto-strategic reserve was presented as sovereignty, even salvation. It was said that America would secure its destiny and digital wealth, as if permanence could be found in a marketplace built on fluctuation. Yet to bind collective well-being to speculation is to mistake volatility for resilience. Like a gambler clutching dice and calling it destiny, the state mistook fortune for stability and speculation for foresight. The gesture looked forward, but its root was avoidance. Another decree declared English the official language of the United States. It was framed as unity, yet unity forced is no unity at all. What appears as a shared tongue may, if imposed, become a boundary that divides rather than a bridge that connects. A culture's true strength is found in the polyphony it can carry without fear. By reducing language to an exclusionary mark, the gesture hollowed out the compassion it claimed to serve. Meanwhile, the deeper wounds multiplied. Tariffs of 25% on steel, aluminum and autos struck hard at supply chains already under strain. Markets reeled, sliding nearly 12%, yet even as the ground shifted, attention was led elsewhere. Cabinet reshuffles filled the air, declassified files stirred speculation, and noise replaced discernment. The body politic, distracted, mistook chatter for substance, and in that distraction the fractures widened unobserved. So often suffering hides beneath quiet surfaces. A river can freeze at the top while the current below grows fast and strong. March bore this character: stillness above, turbulence beneath. The nation accepted the mask of calm, believing its rituals of distraction could hold back the weight of imbalance. But no mask holds forever. The lesson of this month is clear. What is not faced does not vanish. Karma denied will not dissolve, it will press against the walls until the walls themselves break. March showed how a society that seeks stability in optics alone is preparing itself not for peace, but for rupture. The signs were already there, the ice already thin. April would reveal what silence and spectacle had concealed. How long can a house stand when its foundation has been hollowed away. For months, the nation performed the rituals of stability, tending to images of order while leaving the deeper fractures untouched. But karma has its own patience, and when pressure is denied, it gathers weight until the surface cannot bear it. April was the month the mask cracked. It began on April 2nd, a day the administration named Liberation Day. But liberation, when invoked by force, often binds more tightly than it frees. A universal 10% tariff was imposed across nearly 60 countries, with reciprocal escalators baked in, ensuring a spiral of retaliation. China struck back almost instantly, driving effective tariff rates to nearly 145% in some sectors. This was not a negotiation. It was an act of constriction disguised as autonomy. What was called sovereignty functioned instead as severance, cutting the threads of interdependence that had bound economies together for decades. Markets convulsed under the strain. In Europe and Asia, indices plunged. In the United States, trading halted twice within a single week before emergency liquidity injections calmed the slide. But this calm, like all others before it, was synthetic. The scaffolding held, but only because it was propped up from beneath, a structure already leaning, stabilized by borrowed time. Then came the courts. In late April, the Court of International Trade ruled the tariffs unlawful, exceeding presidential authority under the statutes invoked. Here was an opportunity for balance, a chance to let the rule of law slow the spiral. But the administration refused to yield. Orders were ignored, injunctions bypassed, enforcement pressed forward. Each act of defiance seeded further instability, not simply in policy but in the collective psyche, eroding faith in the boundaries that hold governance together. And while the legal knots tightened, DOGE accelerated its dismantling of the federal workforce. By month's end, 100,000 cumulative layoffs had stripped away not only jobs but memory, the deep institutional knowledge upon which continuity depends. Whole branches within agencies faltered, their functions absorbed or abandoned. What had been called efficiency revealed itself fully as depletion. April's lesson is stark. Denial does not pause the karmic tide, it quickens it. To call disruption liberation does not make it so. To override lawful checks does not dissolve their necessity. The refusal to confront imbalance only intensifies its consequences, compounding what must eventually be faced. By ignoring these signals, by leaning harder into force where humility was called for, the nation set itself on a path where the fractures of governance, economy, and trust would feed one another, accelerating toward a spiral no longer contained. One cannot build peace on refusal. When the dharma of interconnection is denied, cause and effect quicken, and outcomes rush forward untethered. April was this, the cauldron reaching its boil, the quiet fragility of March bursting into open crisis. Yet rather than stop, the system would double down. In May, the mask would not simply crack further, it would become part of the performance itself, as harm began to be named without ever being reconciled. When suffering finally surfaces, there is a fleeting possibility of clarity. To name harm is to take the first step toward its release. But naming without integration is only another form of forgetting, another gesture of denial disguised as awareness. May revealed this paradox in full. The language of recognition became the mask beneath which deeper wounds were concealed. By this month, the Department of Government Efficiency had grown into something vaster than its name suggested. 180,000 federal positions were gone. Institutional memory stripped away layer by layer as if the nation were deliberately loosening its grip on its own continuity. The administration called it victory, spoke of streamlined government and modernization, but beneath the rhetoric lay a profound exhaustion of capacity. Agencies bled not only personnel but identity, their roles recast not as stewards of the public good but as inefficiencies to be erased. Outside these walls, analysts, watchdogs, and even the Congressional Budget Office warned of an economic drag unfolding beneath the surface. The projections were sobering, yet they too became tools of narrative. Harm was acknowledged, but only to be recoded. Layoffs were presented as sacrifice for the greater good. Tariffs were no longer a disruption, but a strategy of strength. The nation was invited not to confront its pain, but to reinterpret it as triumph. And so the wound deepened, precisely because it was spoken of without being healed. The spiral accelerated when tariffs on steel and aluminum doubled to 50%, taking effect in early June. Markets, strangely, did not collapse. They rallied. But this was not the rally of confidence. It was speculation untethered from reality, a system floating upward while its ground gave way beneath it. Here was the mirror of February's silence and March's distraction. Even when harm was finally voiced, society drifted further from its source. This is the danger when acknowledgement becomes theater. To speak of suffering without tending to it does not diminish its weight, it multiplies it. In dharmic terms, karma seeks integration. Pain unprocessed will surface again and again until it is met fully with clarity and compassion. But May offered only performance, and performance hardens the patterns it hides. There is an old teaching that illusions defended become prisons. May carried this truth quietly within it. By rebranding harm as progress, the nation bound itself more tightly to its own contradictions, rehearsing stability rather than cultivating it. Beneath the celebration of efficiency and strength, the structures weakened further. There are times when a system can no longer carry what it refuses to name. Pressure gathers beneath the surface until every channel narrows, every pathway clogs, and yet still no release is permitted. June was such a moment, a bottleneck where hidden fractures converged, but no breath was allowed to move through them. Outwardly, the nation seemed to surge with vitality. Beneath, its structures strained toward collapse. By now, the Department of Government Efficiency had crossed an extraordinary threshold. More than 220,000 federal positions eliminated. Entire branches of the Social Security Administration closed their doors. Local offices of FEMA and SNAP reported cascading backlogs, safety nets fraying in real time. In small towns where federal presence once carried continuity, services simply vanished. And yet, far from reckoning with the scale of what was being lost, the administration celebrated the transformation. Efficiency was still the story. Victory was still the mask. The paradox deepened further as federal spending quietly swelled by $200 billion above projections. Reorganizations meant to save costs instead generated new expenses. Agency consolidation left holes that had to be patched in haste, driving resources out faster than they could be replenished. Internal watchdogs raised alarms. Inspectors general warned of dysfunction. And institutional oversight itself began to fail as their offices, too, were stripped down. The very instruments designed to measure risk were dismantled just as risk multiplied. And yet, the markets soared. The S&P broke records. Crypto valuations surged. Hope gathered around fragile tariff negotiations, and speculative capital flooded in, eager to convert volatility into short-term gain. It was a celebration untethered from substance, a euphoria floating high above the unraveling body below. A monk might look upon this moment and ask, what is joy if its root is hollow? What is victory if the foundation on which it stands is dissolving? This was the essence of June truths converging without integration. Layoffs, fiscal overruns, institutional depletion, and speculative exuberance, all pressing together, compressing into silence. A bottleneck is not only a structural phenomenon, it is karmic. When the energy of imbalance is contained without recognition, its pressure does not disperse. It intensifies, seeking release through rupture rather than reconciliation. The lesson of this month is quiet but urgent. No system can carry contradictions indefinitely. Growth without grounding, celebration without care, power without capacity, these create a weight that cannot be borne. To ignore this is to mistake momentum for stability, a rising current for calm waters. In the stillness of June, the signs were all present, even as they went unspoken. The channels were narrowing, the burdens unprocessed, and the flow of consequence gathering strength. Sometimes a system seeks to govern not by solving contradictions, but by multiplying them until no single fracture can be held in focus. July revealed this strategy fully. It was a month of gestures toward compassion, a performance of care woven into the machinery of control, And yet beneath the surface, the current of distrust deepened on all sides. The one big, beautiful bill arrived, a sweeping act of tax restructuring, permanent corporate cuts framed as relief, and billions redirected into enforcement. Medicaid rollbacks were cast as optimization, a promise that fewer resources would somehow serve more. At the same time, tariff wins with Europe, Japan, and the UK were celebrated as diplomatic triumphs, soothing markets still raw from April's shocks. On paper, this was stability. In narrative, it was mastery. But beneath both, something more fragile stirred. In parallel, the White House orchestrated a partial release of the Epstein files, branding it as an act of empathy, a shield to protect victims' privacy. Out of more than 33,000 documents, only about 1,000 pages surfaced, mostly uncontroversial flight logs and secondary correspondence. The Attorney General hinted at a client list, a suggestion designed to stir expectation, then later withdrew the claim entirely. Transparency was offered in fragments, just enough to create the appearance of openness while leaving the substance withheld. This was narrative as governance, care as control. But the gesture did not hold. Within Trump's own base, distrust cracked open. Promises of disclosure had long carried symbolic weight, and when they dissolved into managed ambiguity, the reaction was swift. A MAGA revolt simmered across online spaces as loyalists, conspiracy advocates, and even prominent influencers accused the administration of betrayal. In Congress, unlikely alliances formed. Figures like Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna moved to force the release of the full archives, while bipartisan criticism mounted against the Justice Department for what many called deliberate obstruction. Polls reflected the fracture. Nearly half of 2024 Trump voters disapproved of his handling of the files, and more than a quarter said they would not support him again if given the chance. Even for a presidency steeped in controversy, this was notable. Not for the threat it posed at the ballot box, but for what it revealed about the nature of control itself. Outside the walls of power, July's Free America protests surged across 40 cities, drawing hundreds of thousands. Yet even this movement, vibrant as it seemed, failed to alter the arc of events. In truth, the protests were less catalyst than echo, a collective body twitching under deeper forces it could not command. Inside the White House, this was understood, and in many ways, leveraged. Dissonance became a resource, distraction a deliberate tool. When trust fractures across so many axes, when narratives splinter faster than they can be reconciled, governance shifts from resolving conflict to managing its perpetual circulation. This is the karmic character of July. Empathy invoked as control, control disguised as care, and care collapsing under the weight of distrust. What emerges is not balance, but drift. A society caught in its own distortions turns faster, but without orientation. And as Doge passed 250,000 layoffs, Elon Musk quietly stepped back from its helm, leaving Vivek Ramaswamy to consolidate authority over a hollowed institution, a symbolic inversion of the month's broader pattern. Power centralizes even as capacity dissolves. The lesson July offers is quiet but unsettling. When meaning is manipulated too often, meaning itself begins to decay. In Buddhist thought, when illusions are multiplied beyond the mind's capacity to hold them, awareness slips away, leaving chaos in its place. July was this threshold. By turning compassion into theater and transparency into fragments, the system deepened its own contradictions, setting the stage for the scatter that would define the next descent. There are moments when even the most carefully tended illusions begin to collapse under their own weight. August was such a month. The performance of transparency became so thin it could no longer hide its absence. The gestures of peace, of closure, of resolution appeared on the surface, but underneath, each one opened new fault lines. What had been drift in July became divergence in August, fragments spinning outward, no longer bound even by shared pretenses. The administration presented itself once again as a steward of openness. The Justice Department released transcripts of Ghislaine Maxwell's July interviews, highlighting her denials of any wrongdoing by Trump. and her insistence that no client list ever existed. These were offered to the public as if they might resolve long-standing speculation, framed as a gift of clarity, even compassion. But in truth, the gesture was only a shadow of transparency. A federal judge noted with unusual candor that the executive branch was more capable than the courts of releasing the full Epstein record. Yet, even as he said so, he called the grand jury disclosure a distraction, for it left the majority of files withheld. What was given to the public was not truth, but a carefully chosen portion of it, released to calm while preserving concealment. Such partial offerings might have held in quieter times, but the patience of the body politic was frayed. Among Trump's own base, suspicion turned into open estrangement. Those who had long trusted the promise of revelations now saw only obfuscation. Critics on both right and left alike accused the administration of cover-up. And when whispers spread of potential clemency or softened conditions for Maxwell, even those who had once dismissed such talk felt the weight of misalignment. Justice, already bruised, seemed once more bent toward power. Outside these halls, others prepared a different kind of reckoning. Legislators across party lines announced public hearings with survivors for September, a counterweight to narrative management, a reminder that beneath every withheld page lived human stories, unfinished and unacknowledged. All of this unfolded in parallel with the administration's other August maneuvers, the Alaska summit with Putin, styled as détente but seen abroad as concession, the tariff fractures in pharmaceuticals, where European allies accepted a partial reprieve at 15%, while domestic ceilings of 250% remained a looming threat, and the abolition of de minimis imports, which ruptured consumer pipelines and inflamed backlash across households and small businesses. At the same time, ICE expanded its footprint, opening new detention centers, while lawsuits over federal troop deployments climbed toward the Supreme Court. Diplomacy clashed with enforcement, markets with households, the executive with the judiciary. The wheel turned in too many directions at once, each axis pulling against the others until coherence dissolved. This is what August revealed: transparency without truth, peace without reconciliation, order without justice. Each illusion not only failed to hold but deepened the fracture it was meant to conceal. Karma denied does not fade. It multiplies, and when it multiplies without acknowledgement, it does not form a cycle of return. It breaks into divergence, fragments spinning outward. The lesson here is one of humility, though it was not taken. When a society refuses to face its full truth, offering half gestures in place of wholeness, it sows not stability, but collapse. To release fragments of the story while holding back the substance is to abandon the possibility of resolution. The survivors' voices, the people's disillusionment, the allies' doubts, all are signals of a balance long overdue. August leaves us with no comfort but this: what is concealed will not remain hidden forever. The greater good requires not fragments but fullness, not illusion, but the courage to face the entire ledger of harm. Until such reckoning is embraced, the wheel of karma does not complete its circle, it spins apart. Across these 8 months, we have traced a descent not caused by one act but by a pattern, subtle at first, then relentless. January set the tone. Power claimed the language of renewal but planted domination at its root. From there, each month followed a deeper curve of avoidance and acceleration. The wounds of February were met with silence, not care. March offered the illusion of stability while fractures widened beneath the surface. By April, denial collided with consequence. Policies meant to assert control instead unleashed global retaliation and domestic rupture. But rather than pause, May turned recognition into performance. Harm was named only to be reframed as virtue, and so it deepened. June compressed contradictions into a bottleneck. The state celebrated efficiency while hollowing its capacity, and markets floated untethered above a fraying body. July multiplied narratives until meaning itself began to thin. Partial files, managed disclosures, empathy recast as control, while protests flared without shifting the deeper machinery. By August, the fragments spun apart entirely. Diplomacy clashed with enforcement, transparency dissolved into performance, justice bent toward power, and trust eroded even among the faithful. From this, patterns emerge. Prophetic, not because they foretell a single outcome, but because they reveal the structure of imbalance itself. When beginnings are encoded with rupture, the cycle cannot stabilize. When harm is silenced, it embeds itself into the system, shaping policy and narrative alike. When transparency becomes fragments, trust decays faster than it can be rebuilt. When empathy is performed as strategy, it corrodes the language of care until meaning itself collapses. The result is drift. Institutions still stand, but the coherence that gives them life thins month by month, until the wheel no longer turns. It splinters. And yet the teaching here is not despair, but discipline. A system cannot be restored by speed, spectacle, or control. The path back to balance is slower, requiring humility to pause where we rushed in January, to listen where we numbed in February, to speak plainly where March offered distraction, to accept lawful limits where April defied them, to tend harm rather than reframe it as progress, to integrate truths rather than bottling them beneath euphoria, to live empathy rather than perform it, and to offer transparency whole rather than in fragments. Without this, each cycle will inherit the fractures of the last. The history of these 8 months makes the call plain. Wholeness cannot be manufactured, it must be cultivated. If we cannot hold the truth fully, the truth will find other ways to speak, through unrest, through markets, through systems that strain until they break. The center returns only when care is chosen over control, substance over spectacle, and stewardship over domination. Without that turning, the wheel does not close, it flies apart.